Hi, Courtney Friedman here, coming to you from the KSAT 12 newsroom. Thank you so much for joining us for this roundtable discussion on the connection between mass shootings and domestic violence. Experts say this connection has been studied, but it's often overlooked, and it's crucial to preventing future mass shootings. Our South Texas community knows all too well the pain that's caused by these tragedies after Sutherland Springs 5 years ago and Uvalde almost 5 months ago. So it's our leaders and representatives who are taking up this cause and paying attention to the important connection. We have 4 panelists that are part of our effort to make those changes to keep our communities safe. I would like to introduce Judge Monique Diaz, who presides over the 150th Civil District Court and is also co-chair to Bexar County's Collaborative Commission on Domestic Violence, which helped create this very town hall. Julia Weber is the implementation director at the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. We are honored also today to have with us both U.S. Congressman Joaquin Castro and State Senator Jose Menendez. Thank you so much, all 4 of you, for taking time to talk about this important issue today. So the most recent study on this topic was released in 2020 by the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Let's take a look at these numbers. It showed in more than 2/3, that 68.2% of mass shootings analyzed, the perpetrator either killed family or intimate partners or had a history of domestic violence. Julia, I'm going to start with you because we know you have studied this specific topic extensively. First, talk to us about the basics when it comes to domestic violence and guns. What do we know about that specific intersection?
Well, thank you, Courtney. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all who are participating in today's event. So we know that the combination of domestic violence and firearms is a particularly lethal one, and that firearms are used to kill, injure, threaten victims, and to kill and harm people who are not in the relationship where violence is going on. Too often, coworkers and members of the public are injured or killed connected to these mass shootings. So we know every year millions of Americans report tragically experiencing domestic violence, which is a situation in which power and control are being used to abuse an intimate partner, child, family member. And although, of course, it disproportionately impacts women as victims, this is something that affects all of us in a variety of ways and is throughout our society across gender, race, class, and so forth. So we also know that an abusive male partner's access to firearms increases the risk of a lethal outcome for a female partner by five times. So we also want to recognize that lethality isn't the only issue. There are over 1 million women alive today who have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. And while mass shootings represent around 1% of all homicides in the United States, firearm-related homicides, we know we've all been impacted by these horrific tragedies in a variety of ways. And as you noted, 2/3 of mass shootings involve some kind of connection to domestic violence. So we all want to know, what are the red flags? What can we do to reduce the risks associated with firearms and outcomes such as mass shootings? People want to know, is there any kind of indication? I think in some ways we can thankfully say yes, domestic violence is a red flag. So the more we can do to take domestic violence seriously, increase safety, reduce risks associated with domestic violence, we're also going to be addressing risks around firearms and mass shootings, and protecting partners as well as the public generally.
Julia, thank you so much. Judge Diaz, you and I talked earlier this week about this exact topic on a story that aired on KSAT on Tuesday. As a member of our South Texas community, you obviously know very well the pain that we've suffered after Sutherland Springs and Uvalde. There are domestic violence connections in both of those situations. Can you explain to our viewers what those are?
Yes, in 2017, we know now for a fact that the shooter in the Sutherland Springs church had a history of domestic violence, and in fact was convicted on 2 counts of domestic assault against his wife, who he beat, strangled, and kicked, and against his son, who he also beat over the head and body. After those convictions, that shooter was prohibited under Texas law and federal law from possessing or purchasing firearms or ammunition. Unfortunately, the Air Force failed to report that to the national database that would have prevented him from purchasing the very firearms that he then used to commit the mass shooting at Sutherland Springs, killing 26 people, 8 of which were children, and 1 of which was an unborn child. We also saw in Uvalde, tragically, recently. We know that it's still being investigated, but it's been reported already by local and national media outlets that the shooter in Uvalde also had a history of violence against women. One of his ex-girlfriends has come out and stated to the media that he was especially violent towards women, including towards her. And there were several young people that met that shooter online and were threatened by him. He threatened to kidnap, rape, killing them. Those young people reported that to the authorities and have stated that those reports were not taken seriously. Had they been taken seriously, had they been acted upon, potentially the shooter in Uvalde could have also been prohibited from purchasing firearms and ammunition, and potentially those 21 lives, including 19 children's lives who were taken, could have been saved. So we've seen those connections here locally. I could go on. We saw that in Orlando and in other places, but it's something that we need to really take a look at more seriously and take more seriously as a community.
Yeah, I mean, we speak about these shootings, and they're speaking about these shootings internationally. It's tragic that 2 of those happening in our own backyard. So Congressman Castro and Senator Menendez, after each of these shootings right here in South Texas, we know there was pain, there was anger, but there was also energy to make change when it comes to both domestic violence and mass shootings. So I want to ask both of you, what changes have you wanted to see after these mass shootings, knowing that they're connected to domestic violence? And I'll start with you, Congressman.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to be here. And it's great to be on with Judge Diaz and State Senator Menendez, and of course, Julia, all of whom are doing wonderful work to try to combat the scourge of domestic violence. But this is a real problem in San Antonio. A few years ago, Lloyd Doggett and I held a town hall to discuss domestic violence issues. And at the time, San Antonio, of all the major cities in Texas, had the biggest problem with domestic violence. So there are a lot of people who are suffering quietly oftentimes without fully reaching out to family members or law enforcement to let them know what's going on and the danger that they're living in. And so you asked the question, what would I like to see? A few things. First, what I've worked on in Congress and supported over the last few years, the reauthorization of VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, to fund or combat domestic violence in the United States, including in San Antonio and in Texas, but also the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which finally closed the boyfriend loophole, for example, and offered funds to states to implement red flag laws. Texas has not done that yet. I know that State Senator Menendez and other Democrats are supportive of that, but the governor and the state's leadership have not committed to red flag laws. That would allow law enforcement to remove firearms from the possession of people who demonstrate that they are a threat to others or a threat to themselves. So the conversation that you just had about warning signs, people committing domestic violence, and then the danger of them being able to still hold on to those weapons, that's ultimately what has allowed people, even after they commit domestic violence, to then go on and commit mass murder. But in addition, my final point, in addition to those things, we have to do something about guns in our state. And the parents in Uvalde and others are asking for something modest from the governor, and the governor should act right away. And that is to raise the age at which somebody can buy a deadly assault rifle from 18 to 21. In Texas, you can't even buy a handgun until you're 21, but you can go buy an AR-15 as the shooter in Uvalde did when you're 18 years old. And so that to me is a big test for the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, is whether they'll make that commitment to the parents of Uvalde and to others in the state who have suffered through mass shootings.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator, same question to you. What changes have you wanted to see after these mass shootings as it pertains to domestic violence as well?
Well, it's pretty simple. We sent a letter right after the tragedy in Uvalde to the governor. Or every one of us in the Senate Democratic Caucus demanded an emergency special session. You know what's so sad? After Parkland in Florida, it only took them 23 days for the governor, the then Republican governor of Florida, to get that passed, to raise the age limit. And it's simple. We need to go, like the congressman said, raise the age to purchase an AR-15 to 21, require universal background checks, implement red flag laws that will confiscate a firearm from anyone that's deemed a danger to themselves or someone else. And you know, so that people understand, this doesn't mean anyone's going to take everyone's guns. What it means is that they're going to, if you're deemed a danger to yourself or someone else, through a due process, that they hold on to those until you're no longer deemed to be a danger. And I think there needs to be a cooling off period. You know what's weird about Texas? When you register to vote, you have to register 30 days before you can vote, but you can buy a gun the same day. What is more dangerous, voting or buying a gun? And we have to, in my opinion, we need to regulate the high capacity magazines. These are just simple things. These are not complicated things. These are things that can save lives. And I don't understand why the governor has not acted. I don't know what he's waiting for. And I think, we shouldn't, I think real political courage is not waiting to see what happens with the election. It's acting now while the need is now. These poor children many of the classmates who fled in fear for their lives had to go back to school with nothing having changed.
I do just want to follow up with both of you because I know that it becomes politicized automatically when we talk about guns and gun violence. But a lot of the work that y'all have talked about is bipartisan. Can you just talk about the pieces that have become bipartisan in Texas and federally that maybe weren't before? Does anything come to mind?
Texas is hard to hear or think about bipartisan gun crime.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to hear or think of anybody. All they want to do is punt to some mental health issues, and they only want to talk about mental health when it comes when a tragedy has occurred. And it's sad because the governor had just taken some money from the mental health budget towards the border initiative, and so I don't understand how you can say one thing when you've just raided the coffers that were supposed to be helping that. So. I'm not sure about in the federal Congress where you're finding some common ground.
Right.
None of this should be partisan because it's not. Lives are not partisan. And no one's talking about confiscating everyone's guns. We're talking about some common sense gun legislation to keep people safe.
And Congressman, you have seen some bipartisan measures come together. I mean, that's something that people have applauded in the federal.
Yeah, I mean, part of the challenge in Congress is that so many bills that there's often a lot of gridlock, right? So it's hard to pass singular pieces of legislation. So the way we've been able to get some bipartisan support for some of the things I described, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, for example, was some of it took years, right? And then the reauthorization of VAWA also took years. But we were able to do that through a larger omnibus bill. So in other words, you took that part and you stuck it in a larger bill and people voted for the larger package. But look, any way it gets done, right, is a good thing. And so both those things that took a while in Congress finally got done. And unfortunately, that was spurred by continued mass shootings and mass tragedies.
Right. Thank you so much. Well, all of this shows, all of the work that you're doing, all these conversations are showing that a lot of these changes that need to happen do have to do with policy. Policies already in place that may have some loopholes or brand new policies, which both of you have just spoken about. Julia, we know it's federal law here in Texas and a federal law and a law here in Texas. So both. If you're convicted of domestic violence, you're not allowed to own a firearm or handle a firearm. Are there issues with those current laws that you've seen? And if so, what changes need to be made?
Well, absolutely. It's certainly worth noting and applauding some current policies that are in place, one of which is the notion that when you become convicted, you are prohibited from having a firearm convicted of a domestic violence offense. It's a critical policy, one that was hard fought as well. And aspects of it could use some improvement in terms of implementation primarily. So we have policies. Victims have every right to expect that when that order is made, when the conviction happens, when someone becomes prohibited, that any firearms that are currently owned would be relinquished or surrendered, turned in, separated at the earliest point as possible from the person who has become prohibited. Unfortunately, that's one of the areas where we need to do a lot more work. There's already been a reference to extreme risk protection orders or so-called red flag laws. Those are prohibitions that don't rely on the relationship. Whereas a domestic violence prohibition, you're going to have that intimate partner relationship in order for that conviction to count as a prohibiting conviction. But we could have the same kind of relinquishment, surrender policies that are mentioned in terms of extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws in our domestic violence laws. So those prohibitions are there. We also need to make sure that they're entered correctly. As Judge Diaz has already mentioned, at Sutherland Springs, that was one of the issues. The prohibition has to be entered correctly so that if someone attempts to purchase a firearms through an otherwise legal process, there would be a recognition that they were a prohibited person. And then lastly, I'd say they can be strengthened by providing ways for those who are protected or are victims of domestic violence, providing ways for them to contact law enforcement, prosecutors, others within our community to say, I know, I've heard they have maintained firearms in violation of the order, and for us to hold those folks accountable. And I would just note that at Giffords, we work with gun owners every day, all the time, responsible gun owners who are committed to common sense gun laws. Anyone who we as a court system have recognized has committed acts of violence against family members is someone we should be very concerned about in terms of their access to firearms, because it puts all of us at risk. So strengthening those laws, ensuring implementation, and providing recourse and accountability, I think, is really critical.
I think the word that sticks out is accountability, and that leads right to what we're doing locally here. As you know, you've been talking with Judge Monique Diaz. We have a collaborative commission of domestic violence here in Bexar County, and one of the things that they have done is closing some of those loopholes. First, we want to show you real quick what the collaborative commission does. It's a court-ordered commission, and that's to ensure that the goals are continuously laid out, successes are put into practice, failures are analyzed. There are 7 different committees that represent every sector of our community that work separately and then also together to close specific gaps that they identify. So those committees, as you can see on your screen, prosecution, judiciary, healthcare, education, law enforcement, nonprofits, and policy. And a lot of successes have come out of those. One of those successes is from the commission is the creation of a process for judges to require follow-up with domestic violence offenders. So Judge Diaz, our viewers have asked what we're doing locally about this issue, and this is the answer. You've had a lot to do with this new process. Can you tell us what it is and why it's needed?
Certainly. Thank you for this opportunity. So as Julia was just mentioning, you know, our laws in Texas and federally do prohibit the possession of firearms or ammunition, but we don't go so far in the state of Texas as requiring the relinquishment or surrender of those firearms or ammunition as a mandatory statutory requirement. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. So in 2019, when Judge Peter Sakai formed the CCDV, back then, the Judiciary Committee took on this tall order of convening stakeholders within all of those sectors that you just mentioned to talk about how we could create a uniform process with forms, instructions, and orders that our judges could use to hold these offenders accountable. Because it's not just in the criminal courts when someone's convicted that they're prohibited from possessing firearms. It's also on the civil side, anytime a civil protective order is entered, a temporary one or a permanent protective order, there is also an immediate prohibition against possessing firearms or ammunition. And up until very recently, we've basically operated on an honor system. and assumed that these individuals are going to somehow relinquish these firearms or ammunition, and there's been no real accountability. So what we've developed, and it's taken us several years to do so, but we've developed a whole series of forms, orders, and instructions so that every judge that wishes to use this process, once that defendant is convicted or the respondent on a civil protective order has that protective order entered against them, we can issue a follow-up order requiring that individual prove their compliance with that prohibition. That can include, especially in cases where we have specifically identified that firearms are in the possession of the respondent or the defendant, we can order that they surrender those firearms and ammunition and their license to carry. Now, this is a temporary surrender, at least for the duration in which they are prohibited from possessing firearms. Due process was mentioned earlier. That is very important to this entire process. We've had defense attorneys, prosecutors, everyone part of this collaboration to make sure that we are respecting everyone's constitutional rights. But we can order the temporary transfer to law enforcement. SAPD and BCSO have worked with us, and they are fully equipped to store those firearms and ammunition for us. An individual could transfer them to a federally licensed firearm dealer or sell them with approval from the court, or they could transfer it to an approved third party. That could be, a family member or a friend that is approved by the court that we know is also eligible to possess firearms or ammunition, passes a background check, and won't return those firearms or ammunition to the individual that possesses them. And then the last part of this process is, as I stated, not everyone is prohibited forever. So if they become eligible to possess firearms or ammunition or a license to carry again, they can motion the court for the return of those firearms, at which point they have to again prove to us that they're going to pass a background check, that they're otherwise eligible to have those firearms or ammunition returned to them. Since we started using these forms, since December of last year, the numbers that I pulled is that we have at least 500 of these orders requiring respondents or defendants to prove their compliance that have gone through these courts. And with further training and education, we're hoping to get more courts on board to start utilizing this process as well.
Wow, 500 is a really impressive number. It shows that what we're doing is working. Obviously, there's always more work to do, but I've done a lot of stories with you on this specific subject when it comes to the new process that you're putting in place as part of my series on domestic violence, loving in fear. I've learned through those stories that the Collaborative Commission is taking a public health approach to domestic violence, almost treating it like a disease itself. Judge Diaz, I'm going to keep you right here. In one of those treatments, I'm going to say treatments, to the disease of domestic violence, it's attempting to stop the cycle that we know is occurring. We know that in some cases, and of course I want to make sure we say it's not all cases, but some cases, these domestic violence survivors of abuse go on to become recurring victims or even perpetrators themselves. So we know that to be true with some of the mass shootings, especially those here locally that you informed us about. Talk to us about that cycle and how that could actually be taken care of to hinder more mass shootings.
You're correct on all of that, Courtney. In fact, the World Health Organization has deemed domestic violence as a global major public health crisis. And just like any other public health crisis, just like we saw with COVID, it requires a public health response in order to truly change that crisis, to have a positive impact on it. We know that one in three women, mostly women around the world, are also victims or survivors of domestic violence. A lot of the domestic violence survivors and victims that we're talking about today at our symposium that's being held by the CCDV are the children. We're trying to focus on those children because we know that domestic violence is cyclical. When you hear the cycle of domestic violence, we're not just talking about a cycle within a relationship or members of a household, but we're talking about generational cycles of abuse that are passed along through children as well. As you stated, unfortunately, victims of one form of violence, including children, are more likely to become victims or perpetrators of other forms of violence in the future, including domestic violence. And so those are the cycles that we're trying to disrupt, and taking a public health approach to treating the problem, as you stated, means for these downstream issues like domestic violence homicides, like mass shootings that are committed by individuals with a history of domestic violence, we have to look upstream and we have to identify opportunities to implement evidence-based strategies upstream that can prevent this from happening downstream. What does that mean? Well, one of the things that it means is making sure that these children who are victims of these various forms of violence, even children like the victims in Uvalde, the survivors in Uvalde that survived that form of violence, that those children are receiving the adequate support and resources from our community that they need in order to properly cope with the trauma that they have experienced in a way that they can rehabilitate themselves and not, unfortunately, become another statistic in the future and not become victims of future violence or perpetrators of future violence. So it all starts with those kiddos and making sure that we're providing them the support that they need, so that they can live a healthy, fulfilling life and not fall into that cycle, into that generational cycle. And that is the focus of our CCDV's third annual symposium this year that's going on right now. This is a town hall that's part of that symposium. And the focus is the impact of domestic violence on children. So we encourage folks, if you haven't signed up already, if you want to learn more about that connection, to go to ccdv.org, register, and we'll have all of the videos posted on our YouTube page later as well.
You're reading my mind, Judge Diaz. We are actually just going to tell people about the symposium. We have a few more details, so let's pull up that graphic right now. So as Monique said, this is a multi-day symposium, and it's every single year to update the public on their work. This town hall, again, one of those many events that we're happy to be a part of here at KSAT. So on your screen is a schedule. Later today, there are sessions still on the impact of generational violence, and then also preparing educators to recognize the signs of abuse. Tomorrow, Friday, there is a session on trauma-informed approaches and another on transformation of public health to address domestic violence. All of these sessions are free and they're all virtual, so you can jump in and jump out as you need to. Very informative sessions. All you have to do at the bottom of this graphic right here, it shows you where to go, ccdv.org, and you can sign up for that. We also want to pull up a graphic on our screen. We always want to make sure that our viewers and our community have the right resources. We want to provide resources for those of you experiencing domestic violence or those of you who know someone suffering from abuse. Anyone in a current emergency, in a crisis, can call or text 911. A reminder that you can text 911. On your screen now are the numbers of the crisis lines for the Bexar County Family Justice Center and the Family Violence Prevention Services, which runs the Battered Women and Children's Shelter. Both offer wraparound services, free legal help, counseling, clothing, food, a lot of services that you may need. You can call and utilize one or all of them. So make sure that if you need help, you can call these numbers right now. So speaking of these resources, these organizations are kept busy locally. Many families here in Bexar County are currently in a domestic violence crisis, and survivors in our community are always asking us here at KSAT what they should do, and we're able to provide them with these resources and experts. But Julia, right now, for anyone watching, what steps can they take to keep themselves safe from gun violence specifically if they are in a crisis in their home?
Well, let me just first say that the work being done in Bexar County is so impressive. I work nationally on this issue, so kudos to all of you for the resources and for the event this week and for just all of the good work that's going on. It's critical, and as you mentioned, wraparound services. This takes the whole community. It involves looking at housing and ensuring safe housing, thinking about the workplace and how we can improve workplace safety with respect to family violence. It takes hospitals and schools and everybody taking appropriate steps to reduce risk. So for those watching who may be in this kind of situation and hopefully working with an advocate, with someone who can assist with developing an appropriate safety plan, that's critical because while domestic violence is so prevalent and affects people across our community, it also is quite diverse and specific in terms of how it is impacting folks, how the abuse looks, how the power and control is exerted in a particular situation. So you need to be working closely with someone who can help you ascertain, identify the best ways for you to be safe in your particular situation. In terms of firearms in particular, one of the things that we haven't yet focused on as much is that when there is chaos and violence, a crisis in a home, in a family situation, there are other types of violence in addition to homicide associated with the intimate partner violence that can occur. But, folks may be at risk for suicide. We've seen an unfortunate increase in many communities around youth suicide. And unfortunately, easy access to a firearm that's not safely stored, which is one of the things you can do if you currently own firearms, and those need to be maintained in your home for some reason to ensure that they are safely stored. You can reduce the risk of suicide, unintentional shootings, and homicide or injury with appropriate storage. If possible, consider removing the firearm temporarily from the home. That can be done voluntarily without a court order. If you're not involved with a court process or you don't have a prohibition in place, there are ways to transfer, sell, or store outside the home firearms that could otherwise put everybody at risk during that crisis. And again, it may not need to be forever, but having easy access to it can really increase the risks that we've been talking about today. So voluntary transfer, get an order from the court if that's appropriate in conjunction with the safety planning that I've mentioned already. And then lastly, I'd say if you're involved in any kind of child custody or sometimes referred to as a parenting time matter, you can develop provisions in your settlement agreement, your mediated agreement, or in the orders that you're asking for from the court that recognizes that firearms might be easily accessible. So that might mean you have virtual visitation for some time until the risk can be reduced. We're all using Zoom and other platforms to interact with each other. Maintaining contact between parents and children can be very critical. But if you don't have a safe way to exchange children between parents or to provide for visitation, consider whether or not it might be safer to do a virtual visit instead. Or consider involving a supervisor or a location that may reduce risk. Because even with the prohibitions, unfortunately, firearms are all too accessible, and we've seen some tragedies associated with folks who have been prohibited and then subsequently obtain firearms. So we want to make sure parenting provisions are also very clear, and that generally people take into consideration the prevalence of firearm ownership and the risks associated with those firearms when you have a domestic violence situation. Because we also are getting a message, unfortunately, from too many who are pushing gun ownership that suggests that having firearms increases your safety in a domestic violence case. And so I would also encourage you to resist that message, because that's not what the research shows. It increases risk. It doesn't provide increased safety.
That's great information. Thank you so much, especially for our community members who are in crisis right now. Taking the subject, I want to take it back to policy. And we'll start with you, Congressman Castro. I'd like to ask what's going on federally to support domestic violence survivors themselves and stopping the cycle of violence.
So through the legislation that I mentioned, for example, we committed more resources, more money for the domestic violence hotline, for rape crisis centers. The American Rescue Plan also committed $5 billion for housing vouchers. One of the biggest problems or challenges that people who are trying to flee a domestic violence situation, one of the biggest problems they face is that they have nowhere to go and or they can't afford to go anywhere. And so the American Rescue Plan set aside $5 billion to be able to provide funding for people to have some place to go. Yeah, so those have been very important pieces. Again, the red flag law, the red flag piece, is a piece that the Texas legislature, and again, I know that State Senator Menendez and other Democrats in the state Senate and in the state House support this, but Texas needs to pursue those red flag laws because remember, sometimes people will commit domestic violence and then do it again. So it's not like we're dealing oftentimes with one event or one instance. It's often a repeated series of events, sometimes in escalating severity. So the quicker we can enact red flag laws, the better.
And Senator Menendez, what about on the state level, supporting domestic violence survivors and stopping this cyclical violence? Oh, I think you're muted. That's Zoom for you, right?
Yeah, I'm out of Zoom practice, thank goodness.
No worries, go for it.
So the most important thing we can do is to institute the what we call red flag laws, where you've been deemed through a judicial process, a due process, to be a danger to yourself or someone else. It's only common sense, and I think Julia hit on something that's critically important. You shouldn't have to have a judge deem you dangerous. If you really love the people that you live with or say that you love, and you know that the situation's a little iffy or you're not in a good place, you should willingly ask for law enforcement to help hold on to your firearms. And so there should be no need for this. But unfortunately, in this state and others, there definitely is a need. And we need to have those. Look, the stats show that when there is domestic violence, the presence of a firearm leads to 500% more the probability that there'll be a homicide in that domestic violence situation. And the congressman was absolutely right. The recidivism rate is dramatic. In many ways, or many cases of the perpetrators of domestic violence, this is just something that's deep-seated through possibly some childhood adverse experience that's caused some trauma. Maybe they were victims of domestic violence. Maybe they were witnesses of domestic violence, and then this is what their normal is, and they've never been treated for this. And so what can we do at the state? We need to really drive home some mental health dollars and meet people where they are. We need to have mental health access. There are too many mental health deserts. We need to be having mental health true social emotional counselors in the schools. We need to be having real counselors and therapists that are available where people can afford them and can meet them. The problem is just that even with insurance, it's hard to find someone who's accessible. COVID exacerbated and showed how bad the situation is. And I think as a state, we need to make an investment that we really care about the community that we have and understand that this is a real public health issue.
I like the verbiage, mental health deserts, because that's something, like you said, we found with COVID, but also with Uvalde in small communities where that is not available. And I know that creating this policy takes a lot of work. So there's a lot of great policy that's been created and is in queue, but we all know there's more work to do, especially speaking of Uvalde when it comes to mass shootings and the increasing number of mass shootings. We know as Americans it is getting exhausting and painful. So the research has shown that domestic violence related mass shootings are associated with a higher death tolls than mass shootings that are unrelated to domestic violence. So Julia, you touched on this earlier, but can you explain why that is?
Well, I think it's important to understand what domestic violence is really about, which is at the core of the issue is power and control. It's often associated with jealousy, rage, the need to control a particular individual, your partner or family member. There's a wonderful way of thinking about this that has been promulgated by a domestic violence prevention advocate, Barbara Hart, who has found that consistently, despite the many different ways domestic violence is perpetrated, consistently victims experience someone who perpetrates domestic violence against them as saying, number one, I get to make the rules. It's a rule-making situation. I'm the one in charge. So there's no equality or shared rule-making authority in that relationship. Number two, you can't tell anyone anything about what's going on. Number three, you can't leave. And number four, you must always be loyal. So when there is any attempt to leave, to tell anyone about it, to talk about the individual as being violent or problematic, that victim is at extraordinary risk. And so we believe that in mass shootings that are associated with domestic violence, they're very specifically targeted with a very determined focus to eliminate, murder, kill the particular intended victim. So not as non-specific or as indiscriminate as a general need to create chaos or do harm, but to really eliminate the particular people that abusive person has wanted to control or maybe jealous or enraged around, and to do specific harm to others who might be associated with them. So for that reason, we have seen, unfortunately, a particularly high rate of death in domestic violence related mass shootings. So I think it's critical to really understand what's at the heart of domestic violence and how dangerous and threatening it is. Again, not only to those who are experiencing it on a regular basis, but to all of us.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think what it comes down to is that domestic violence and preventing the next mass shooting is everyone's responsibility. Whether you live here in southern Texas, where we've had 2 of these incidents, it doesn't matter where you live, it's every single person's responsibility. So I just want to ask each of you, what can we as community members, anyone that's watching this right now, who wants a takeaway, what can I do? I'm going to ask each of you what that person can do in your eyes. Judge Diaz, I'll start with you.
Certainly. And you're right that we can all do something about it, because one thing that we may not all realize is that every single one of us knows someone that's experienced domestic violence. I shared earlier, 1 in 3 women have experienced domestic violence. So that means that we can all do something about it. And one of the most important things that we can do is, if you do know someone that is in a violent relationship, is to just be there for them and to not abandon them. Because one of the criticisms that we hear so often is that, oh, what can I do to help that victim? They just keep going back, or they just won't leave. Well, leaving a domestic violence relationship is not only the most lethal and dangerous time for someone to leave a relationship, but it's also a very, very difficult thing to do when you're dealing with these power and control issues, when you have children involved, when you may be reliant financially or otherwise upon your abuser. It is a very tough thing to do. So if you have a friend, a family member, a coworker, a neighbor who is in a relationship like that, don't turn your back on them if they're not leaving. Don't turn your back on them if they go back. Be that steady person in their life that will always be there for them for the moment when they're ready to leave. Like Julia said earlier, it's also very important, if you have an opportunity to talk to someone like that, to encourage that they create a safety plan so that when they are ready to leave, they can safely leave the home and with their children. If possible, you can do that through family violence prevention services here locally. You can call the non-emergency number through SAPD to do that as well. And then lastly, as a community, one of the most important things that we can do is just to educate ourselves on the complexity of domestic violence, to learn more about it, to learn what resources are out there. And that's why I'm so grateful for KSAT live streaming this and helping educate our community about these issues. That's why I encourage everyone to join the CCDV symposium to learn more about the problem and what you can all do about it. Our parents, our caregivers, all have an opportunity to teach our children what a healthy relationship is and isn't, so that they hopefully don't find themselves in abusive relationships in the future. So those are some of the key takeaways I would recommend our community consider.
Thank you so much for all of that information. Senator Menendez, do you want to add to that?
Sure, absolutely. I think the judge covered a lot of ground, but I think what we could do too is look towards our public school system. And, the judge at the end was talking about what are healthy relationships. And I think we need to start teaching young people at a young age, no matter what it is they have observed, wherever it may be, that relationships need to be about respect. And you should never, no matter how much you quote unquote love someone, let them to treat you disrespectfully, and let them try to use or abuse or try to gain a power position in a relationship. It needs to be an equitable relationship. And so we need to pour some resources for proper mental health so that people understand what proper relationships are. Because I think domestic violence, like a lot of other violence, starts off with little things. And as Julia mentioned, the fact that a lot of domestic violence situations have to do with power and probably insecurities of these perpetrators, that they feel insignificant and that they have to, make themselves feel stronger or better over someone. And so they do this with someone that they have in an emotional relationship. And so What can we do as a community? I think we need to raise awareness about domestic violence. And I think we need to tell people that if they know something, they need to actively let people know, hey, that's not okay. You know, you need to speak up. I know a lot of people, we like, it's not my place, I shouldn't say anything. But people need to, if you love someone, you care about someone, you need to let them know. One, I'm there for you. Two, it's not okay for this to be happening. And three, here are some resources. Here are some places you can go. I guess, and finally, I think it would be, I hate the fact that it's become political, but I think at the end of the day, just like our budgets are our moral statements for whether it's our home, we budget what we value, or our state government or federal government, wherever we put resources, financial resources, these are things that we value. And so we need to be talking to those people who are wanting to represent us to see if they share our same values in what's important for our future. And so I think that as members of the community, no better time than now to be asking people who are asking you for their support, where are your values? Where are your priorities? Because we need to know that we're there. We need to be behind people who are there for the safety of everyone, and not just the special interest.
Right. I know there's been a lot of good points. Congressman Castro, and anything you want to add to that?
I would just add to all of that, those great words. For those folks who are watching, in addition to pressing political leaders to really commit to combating domestic violence, including spending more resources and passing things like red flag laws and anti-bullying efforts and so forth, for those that do have the financial resources, I would encourage you to consider supporting efforts to combat domestic violence as well here in San Antonio. As I mentioned earlier, San Antonio, of the major Texas cities, has the biggest problem with domestic violence. So you have a lot of people who are suffering at home, often undercover, so to speak, quietly, without neighbors or even sometimes family members knowing about it. And so there's a lot of work for all of us to do in ridding San Antonio of this scourge of domestic violence.
Thank you for that. And Julia, I'll circle back with you. Anything else for our community members that they need to know?
Well, certainly all of the above. I support everything that's been said. And what I would add is that just a recognition that these are complicated and messy situations. You may not get a story about domestic violence that's linear or clear. It may be confusing and difficult to talk to someone who's experiencing domestic violence. Some of the most rewarding folks to work with are people who are being violent themselves. And you may have no idea. It may be hard to believe. These are really messy and complicated situations. So rely on experts who have familiarity with what it's like to try and understand a situation and to make appropriate plans. And then, sort of in line with what's already been said, I'd say wherever you sit, if you're an employer, offer policies that allow people to miss work so that they can go to court hearings, or they can share with you a restraining order so that you can know more about what's happening in their lives so as to make the workplace safe. If you work in a hospital, be clear about your screening procedures so that you can treat domestic violence as the public health problem that it is. If you work in a school, be sure to recognize some signs that children might be bringing into the school environment that suggest that there's family violence happening at home. Don't just think of it as merely a private matter. Respect privacy, respect the need to be safe and appropriate in terms of working with individuals and families, but also take seriously the fact that this is a public health crisis and one that we all have a role to play in addressing.
Those are all such wonderful points, and I truly appreciate all of that insight. It comes from all different directions, and I think the main thing is that we just need to be more educated about this. This is no longer as taboo as it used to be, and that's our point here at KSAT, is really to make sure we're having these conversations. So it's nice to see the Collaborative Commission making sure that each specific topic is being fleshed out. I do want to make sure that you guys get the information on the continuing symposium that the Collaborative Commission's doing. So again, here is the rundown of the Collaborative Commission's ongoing events today as well as tomorrow. So these sessions are all on your screen. I want to make sure you know that they are free, they are virtual, and we can go to Friday's events too. So these are the rest of the day today, and then these are the main ones tomorrow on Friday. All you have to do, these are all virtual, go to the bottom of the screen, ccdv.org, and you can sign up for any of those free virtual events. And as always, again, we want to provide you resources for those experiencing domestic violence or those of you who know someone suffering abuse. Take a look at your screen. If you're in a current emergency, call or text 911. But also the Family Violence Prevention Services number 210-733-8810 and the Bexar County Family Justice Center 210-631-0100. I do get this question a lot. It's Family Violence Prevention Services that does run the Battered Women and Children's Shelter. In closing, I just want to thank our panelists so much. All four of you had so many wonderful things to say. I hope the community learned something. I know this is a difficult subject to talk about, but given this has been in our backyard twice, I think it's obviously time that we kind of look at what we can do ourselves to help the situation. So thank you, all four of you, for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you, Courtney.
All right, and thank you for
Courtney.
joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're a viewer here, if you missed part of this, we're going to have this whole session. We'll put it on our website, ksat.com. And thanks again. Have a great day.